In this tutorial, we're going to be looking at how to create vector patterns by using the vector texture tool, which can be used to create patterns ranging from abstract wavy textures to those that could be used for a faux wood grain effect. Once we have created the toolpaths for our textures in this tutorial, it will be followed by a subsequent vector toolpathing video which can be accessed through the related video section. So with that, let's look at how to create the pattern you see on the screen from scratch by first going to File, Close. So let's start by setting up a new job. So File, New. We're going to be starting with a single-sided setup. Our width will be 24 inches, our height will be 12 inches, and the material thickness will be 3/4 of an inch. We're going to be zeroing from the material surface, and the XY datum position in this case will be in the lower left-hand corner. And now we've created our workspace, we can look to place a vector texture onto it. And to do that, under our drawing menu, we can come over to create vectors, and we have a lot of different options to create different shapes. But in this case, we're going to be using the vector texture tool. And as you open up the form, you'll notice a number of different parameters which affect the texture. But before we take a look at these, I'm just going to show you a preview of the vector texture you saw in the introduction. So that gives you an idea of how these settings affect the created pattern. But for now, I'm just going to go through and reset all of these, just so that we can go through them one by one and show how each setting affects the pattern individually. Just change these over. Click Preview. And there you can see we've got a very simple pattern as a starting point. I can also make changes and preview this item to modify it, and then pressing OK will create the vectors. So if we start with the top setting, angle, we'll see that it's currently set to 0 and the wave is parallel to the x-axis. But if we go ahead and enter a value of say 30 degrees in the angle, then you'll see that the wave will change to a 30-degree angle in relation to the x-axis. And I can also use the slider to change that and preview. But for now, I'm just going to put that back to 0 degrees, and we'll go down to the next parameter, which is line spacing. What is meant by that is the distance between two peaks of the wave or two troughs. And you will get a slight variation in some of the other areas, but essentially the peaks and the troughs will always be of this value. So if I lower that down to 0.5, or increase it to 2. By clicking preview each time instead of OK, you'll get an instant update on the screen of the result that achieved. So I'll just put that back to 0.5 because I think that's about right, and we'll have a look at the variation slider underneath. And just to show what this does, if I just increase the slider here, you'll see that the lines are still parallel to each other, but the line spacing between each set of waves will vary. So you can use that to create a more randomized pattern, and just use the slider here. You can change that to less variation, and increasing it will increase the variation of the line spacing between two sets of waves. And with that, I'm just going to set max spacing back to 1 and set the variation slider back to 0. And now we're going to move down to wave parameters. And the first setting here is amplitude. So amplitude is the vertical distance between the peak and the adjacent trough. Just to demonstrate that, I'm just going to come out of the texture tool and use the measure tool. And we can select a point on one of the peaks and one of the troughs, just roughly, and you'll see that showing Y distance 0.9983, so roughly 1 inch. So that's correct to the parameter that we have under amplitude. And as we've just exited and re-entered the form, I'm just going to demonstrate now how you can reselect the vector texture after you've exited the form, come back into the create vector texture form and apply further modifications to the same pattern. So I'm just going to change the amplitude to 0.5 first. And you'll see that that gives us a much more subtle curve. And then to 2. And you'll see that the wave is then much more accentuated. And just like the angle, you can also do that with the slider. But for now, I'm just going to set that back to 1 inch. And we're going to come down to look at wavelength. Now this, as shown by the diagram next to it, is the distance between two peaks or two troughs. And this will affect how many waves you'll actually see on your screen. So in this case, because we've got 6 inches set and it's a 24-inch part, we should be seeing 4 waves on the screen, which we are. And if we just lowered that down now to 2, on our 24-inch material, we'll be seeing 12 waves. So now there's a distance of 2 inches between this trough, and so on. You can also use values which are close to the width of the material. So if I change that to 18, that will give you 1 1/3. And you can also go greater than the material width. So if we go to 32, and that will give you 2/3 of a wave. So now I'm just going to set that back to where we had it before as well, back to 6. And we'll move down to talk about the noise slider. And this will essentially introduce distortion into the line. So at the moment we've got a very smooth line, but if we add some noise in, you'll see that the line becomes jagged and distorted. And the level of distortion will vary based on the max line spacing. So if you have a higher max spacing, so the higher the max spacing, the greater amount of noise will be introduced into the line. So just to demonstrate this, I'm going to move that up to maximum noise, and you'll see that we've got considerable distortion in the lines now, based on the fact that we've got quite a large max spacing of 1 inch. But if I then reduce the max spacing to, say, 0.25 and preview that, you'll see that the noise is greatly reduced as it's got a much smaller distance in which to create the noise. Okay, so now that we've gone through all of the different parameters that we can modify to change our texture, the last part of the form you'll see here is place vectors on a layer, so you can specify which layer you'd like them to be placed on. But in this case, with that unchecked, we press OK, that'll be added onto your currently active layer. So we'll just double check that by switching the visibility of layer 1 on and off. And what you can also do is selecting the texture again, come back into the texture form, and instead of having it placed automatically on your active layer, you can also create a new layer for it to be placed on from this form. So if you check place vectors on layer, and I'm going to call this one textures, I'm going to preview and then OK that to close out the form. And then if you come up here to the layers menu, we'll see that a new layer is being created called textures. It's the active layer, and if we just switch this off and on again, you can see that it's been placed on that layer, and layer 1 is still empty. Okay, so the next thing for us to take a look at would be how to place the texture in a specific area. So I'm just going to select the texture that we have currently and delete that. And I'm just going to come over to the Create Vectors menu and Draw Polygon tool. And I'm just going to place a polygon in the center of the screen and just grow it out to the size that we want. And I would like to place the texture just in the area of this polygon now. So to do this, I'll make sure I've got the vector, the closed vector highlighted, come back over to the texture form, and I'd click preview again. And you can see now that that's just been placed within the area of the polygon, and it's also been placed onto the textures layer again, seeing as we had that checked. So if we just OK, and we can just look at that by coming up to the textures layer again, and you can see it's been placed on that active layer. Okay, so that's just an easy way for us to be able to specify an area of texture just by selecting the vector and then coming into the form. Okay, so now that we've looked at all the parameters that we can use to create a texture, we need to now look at how we'd apply that in a real world scenario. So let's say we wanted to create large wall panels, but we've got a machine of a limited size, and so to achieve this we'd have to machine this separately in individual panels. So how would you go about this? There are a couple of different methods. One would be to make sure that we've created a tileable texture in the first place, so one that would match up end on end when we line the panels up. Or the other would be to create the full texture on a workspace that matches the size of the full panel, and then use the toolpath tiling to then divide this up into sections that we can cut on our machine. But first we're going to take a look at making a smaller textured panel which is tileable. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete the vectors and the existing texture. And I'm just going to go back into the Create Vector Texture tool. And I'm going to set the parameters back to our original settings. So it was 116. Going to reduce the noise back to 0 and preview. And now we're back to where we were originally. I'm happy with that, so I'm going to press OK to accept that. And we can just look over this to see if we can duplicate this panel and tile the individual panels together. So we can see on the left hand side, it looks like that would match up with the right hand side of the wave. The crests at the top look like they would match up nicely with the bottom of the existing panel. So it is looking at a glance as if this is a tileable texture, but we can just double check this first by zooming out. And we're going to look at copying these vectors and placing them side by side to simulate a tiled panel. So I'm just going to select those texture vectors. I'm going to hit my right mouse button, copy, and then again, right mouse click, paste. And I'm just going to pick that up, drag it over and place it in position so that it matches with the edge of the existing panel. So that's looking good. And then we can copy both of those again. So selecting the two sets of vectors, and then this time we can, on the keyboards, Control C, Control V to paste those out. And I'm just going to pick those up and place them at the top. And now we can clearly visualize the 4 individual tiles together. So that's confirmed that we do have a tileable pattern there. And now that we've confirmed that, we can look to create 4 new textures now, which we can then use for a later vector texture toolpathing video. So if we just select all of these and delete, and I'm also just going to delete out our textures layer as we no longer need that. So we're just left with the original layer 1 that was created when we set up the new job. Now, as we move on to create these vectors, we need to be aware of how we're actually going to machine these panels. So I want my panel to be 24 inches by 12 inches, but I'd like to make sure that the tool actually runs past the edge of the panel for it to then be trimmed away with a profile pass around the edge. So really I need the texture to be larger in X and Y than the workspace, and then I can place a rectangular vector around the edge so that I can trim this back to 24 by 12. So to do that, I'm going to need to reset the job dimension. So under File Operations, we'll go back into the job setup form, and I now want to increase the width to 25 and the height to 13, and then we can click OK and you'll see that's been applied. And now we're just going to create a rectangular vector which will represent the dimensions of our finished panel. So with that, we're going to come up to Draw a Rectangle under Create Vectors. And we're going to want the width to be 24 inches, height to be 12 inches. Click Create to place that on the screen, and as you can see, that's been placed off the workspace. So we're going to close out of that form, select the vector, and we're going to come up to the Align Selected Objects tool. And under Align to Material, we're going to choose the center option to center it on the workspace. So now that gives us a border of 1/2 inch around the edge from which we can trim away to achieve our required dimensions. So our workspace is 25 by 13 and this vector is 24 by 12, the dimensions that we would like our panel. And with that now set up, we can now look to start creating our first textures. So we've still got the parameters for our basic texture here, so we're going to need to edit some of these. And our first texture is going to be a wave pattern. So our angle can actually stay at 0. Our max spacing is going to decrease to 0.3, variation minimum. Our amplitude will remain at 1, wavelength at 6, and the noise at 0. And I'm actually just going to name this wave and create a new layer. So if I click preview, and as you can see, it's going right up to the edge of the workspace. So it's exceeding the boundary of this vector, which represents the size of the panel. And I'm happy with that, so I can click OK. So if we check what's been created, come up to the layers menu, and we can see the new layer, active layer called wave has been created, and that texture has been placed on that layer. But I'm actually going to go back to layer 1 and keep that as my selected active layer, and actually switch off for now the wave layer that we've just created. And while we're here, we might as well rename this layer 1 to something which makes sense to us. So because it's going to contain the cutout vector, I'll name that cutout, just to keep us organised. And double checking that that's still the active layer, we can now come back into the Create Vector Texture tool and look to create our second set of texture vectors. So this time our angle is going to be 45 degrees. Our max spacing will increase from 0.3 to 0.35. Our amplitude is going to increase by 0.5 to 1.5. And our wavelength is going to stay the same and also keep the noise at the minimum. And we're actually going to name this one Step. That'll make sense in just a second when we preview it. And you'll see that the wave steps up the screen in a 45-degree angle, just how we wanted. So I can commit that by pressing OK. Come back up to our layers menu just to check, and we can see that that's being drawn on as visible at the moment. So we'll just switch that off and just reselect the cutout as the active layer, just so that we can come back into the Create Vector Texture and create our third texture with an angle which increases to 60 degrees this time. Our max spacing is going to decrease slightly again to 0.3, set the variation at around 60%. And the biggest changes I'm going to make here are with amplitude and wavelength. So amplitude's going to now increase to 8 and wavelength will increase massively to 16. And now those are all set, we don't need to worry about noise because that's set at 0. And we're going to call this one Swirl. And preview, which creates a swirling pattern with great movement. So happy with that again, so I can click OK. And just again, checking the layers and making sure that cutout is my active layer again, so that I can come back in and think about the final texture. So because this is the texture that we're going to create to resemble the wood grain, we're going to have a very slight angle on this of 2 degrees. Our line spacing is going to be 0.15, very minimal amplitude of 0.1. I'm happy with my variation at around 60% as it was previously. The wavelength is going to increase again to 18, but this time we're going to switch the noise up to around halfway, around 50%, and this one's going to be called Wood Grain. And if we just go ahead and preview this, you can see how this is starting to mimic a wood grain, but this will become more apparent when we come to look at this in the later texture toolpathing video. So happy with that again, so we can OK out. Okay, so before we can save this part away, ready for toolpathing in a later video, let's just have a look at some of the nodes that have been created for these vectors. So with that, I'm just going to switch off the wood grain layer and switch back on the wave layer that we created earlier. And we can start to take a close look at these shapes. So you can select it as a single entity again, and of course go back into the form to make any edits to the parameters. But you can also use a different method to modify individual points on these vectors. But before we can do that, we just need to ungroup these vectors. So I'm going to right click, come down to ungroup objects, and we've got two options. So ungroup back onto original objects layer and ungroup onto groups layer. So we're going to need the second option of those two. But before we do that, we just need to make sure that wave is still our active layer. So it is, and then we can go ahead. So ungroup onto groups layer. And now if we click off, you'll see that we've now got individual vectors for each wave. What that then enables me to do is by selecting one of the vectors and clicking N on the keyboard, that puts that into node edit mode. And if we zoom in, we can see that this wave is actually made up of lots of single straight spans. But that's not a problem because as the toolpaths are going to essentially be a series of straight lines anyway, it shouldn't affect the toolpathing. But what might be a slight problem is if we want to make individual edits to these lines, by moving the points individually, we're going to have to move a lot of them together to make any change to the shape of the line. Instead of that, we need to reduce the number of points on each vector by rationalizing them. And we do have a tool to do that. If you come over to the Edit Objects, Curve Fit, open the form and you get three options. So fitting type, circular arcs, Bezier curves, or straight lines. The tolerance is the amount that we're going to allow the curves to be modified within the algorithm. So in this case, we'll put that at around 0.02 of an inch. It's not going to apply in this case because we haven't got any, but we can keep the sharp corners ticked. And we want the fitting type to be Bezier curves, and we can go ahead and preview that. As you can see, we've dramatically reduced the amount of points in this curve. So we've already previewed it. I can click OK to accept it. And if we go back into node editing mode now, you can see that with the reduced amount of points, it's much easier to make individual modifications to each point to tailor each curve to your requirements. So that just goes to show, as well as the methods and parameters of the Create Vector Texture tool, there are other ways that you can gain better control of the outcome by individually editing each curve to your liking. Okay, so now we've got all the vector textures that we're going to need for our later texture toolpath video, and we can go ahead and save this file away. So I'll go up to File, Save As, and I'm going to save that as Vector Textures Vector Drawing.crv. Click Save, and that's saved away for toolpathing at a later point.